Email is extremely complex. It's the art and science of email marketing, right? So we could talk the science, the technical piece all day long. That's great. But if you have that relationship with the recipient and you build that relationship over time, email is easy.
Hey, what's up, everyone? This is Jeremy, founder of QuickMail.io.
Hey, and this is Jack from emailsthatsell.com. Today, interview. Ladies and gentlemen of the Cold Email Outreach podcast, we've got a special guest today. David Fowler is an email veteran. He's been managing a whole lot of email-related activities since 2003. And let's see what happens. But my guess is David is probably going to be the most knowledgeable deliverability expert we will ever have on the show. He's headed up deliverability for companies like Blue Hornet, YesMail, Info Group, and ZoomInfo. You can find him linkedin.com/in/OregonLimey or at Twitter @OregonLimey. That's LIMEY. David, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. How are you guys doing today?
Great. Thanks for being here. It's awesome to have you.
Awesome.
Yeah, we're pumped, man. This is obviously a hot topic, and we're just lucky to have you on the other end of the microphone here to share some ideas and sort of stories from the battlefield, if you will.
Absolutely.
So let's kick things off here. As we start talking about email deliverability, what is it and why should I care about it so much if I'm into sales, sending email, that kind of thing?
Email is the workhorse of the digital environment or the digital ecosystem. And essentially, if you don't have an email address in the digital sphere, you don't really exist, right? You can't get a social account, you can't rent a car, you can't get a confirmation, etc. So when you think about email, it is the 200-pound gorilla of the digital marketing ecosystem. Now, why deliverability is important is because if you can't get your email into the recipient's inbox, or now, whichever folder they're using at these email clients, then it's not going to get converted on, and therefore your transaction won't occur or your communication won't happen. And, as we sit here in this, really very worrisome time that we find ourselves in, the concept of sending out things that work, like email and SMS and phone calls, is more paramount than ever. And, I've been in the space since 2003. I knew nothing about commercial email when I got into the agency I worked for, did a bit of research. And my first couple of months, the company I worked at was called Outbound, was at the FTC Spam Summit in Washington, D.C. in 2003, which was the precursor for the Counter-Spam Act of 2004. So if you fast forward the clock to where we are today, a lot of the things that you as a sender of email, both commercial and transactional, haven't really changed much. But what has changed is that within the ecosystem that we operate in, the responsibilities and your obligations now have shifted from the receivers to the senders. And we're going to get into that a little bit through the podcast. But the point being is that's why it's so important to get it right. If you don't get it right, it's not going to work. So if it doesn't work, you're not going to sell anything and you're not going to communicate with anyone.
Thanks for the bit of a background. We may want to drill back into, how you came to be such a leader in the email deliverability space. But for right now, where's the best place to start this discussion on deliverability? What's square one when we want to try and figure out how to get it right?
I think square one is more paramount now than it's ever been, really, is the data that you have and how you acquire and manage and nurture the data within your respective organizations. Because we are now in a data-driven, results-based environment, right? And that was not the case before. And really, when you think about the digital channel, the CRM platforms are connected to the marketing automation platforms, which are connected to email service provider platforms. They're all it's all one big digital pipe now. And the reality is that to succeed, you have to have your data in play from the moment you acquire it, nurture it, manage it, and certainly use it. And that's the thing you've got to get right out of the gate.
A lot of our listeners are sending email for their cold email campaigns. So I'm wondering if we can maybe either simplify or just really understand what we mean about our data in terms of a cold email campaign. Is it as simple as making sure that the emails I have are both valid and fresh enough so I know that they are not likely to bounce? What else do I need to think about?
So when you think about that, you think about really when you're sending out emails that have no engagement on them, they're cold emails. Essentially, they're just digital cold calls, right? Instead of picking the phone up, you're sending out an email to a particular individual that you may or may not have certain pieces of data on, etc. And the thing to remember too is that the inbox, the real estate with the inbox is very limited. So you're in a battle royal for everyone else trying to get into that particular email client. So when you think about, there's two types of emails, right? There's cold emails and then there's warm emails. So, acquisition or nurturing emails versus, contextual or reputational based or engagement based. And really the receivers, when they receive that mail stream, they don't distinguish between the two, right? They look at a message as a message. Okay. And so consequently, you as the sender and the marketer of that message have to understand that as you start to campaign or ramp up your campaigns appropriately. We all know that it's really hard to send cold emails. You're making phone calls, the same thing. You'd make 100 phone calls, maybe someone will say yes. And the economies of scale with email is you could send 100 million emails and maybe 10% get through or whatever the case may be, right? So the problem is compounded, but the good news is that if you do the things correctly, you can embrace that channel that will help you get through and get delivered. Now, you asked me early on about the number one thing to think about. Getting to the inbox is one thing, but having someone convert on the message that you're sending them is a completely different discussion, right?
Yeah, and we got plenty of episodes for that specifically. And Jack is a superstar at that as well. But one thing I'd like to sort of re-explore a little bit in all the great thing that you were saying, and to make it like a bit more concrete, is you mentioned about engagement and reputation based. Can you tell me like concretely, if I'm just joining this podcast, for example, and I want to send some email, how does that really affect me? Or to what extent should I really start looking into those things? And can I actually see how much, what's my reputation or how well I'm doing on those things?
Sure. Okay. So there's three of us on this podcast today. We all have a specific reputation in our own ecosystems. We've met each other, we've formed decisions and opinions on each other based on that. Now, in the email channel, that's done digitally, right? And that's done by a number of factors, because the thing to remember with an email is that anything you send out with an email, IP address, domain, authentication, content, links, all those components have reputational assessments on them. And what you have to do is you have to get them to the point where when you send the message out, it has to go through a series of barriers, which will allow you to actually make it to the inbox and then to get converted. So if you're starting afresh today, a lot depends on, the amount of mail you're sending, how often you want to send it, whether you have a shared IP or dedicated IP address. Do you have any other kind of sending history? How long has your domain been registered, et cetera, et cetera. So there's multiple digital data points that you have to think about and be considered. And what's happening is that, what we as marketers don't see is what happens to the message when it gets to within the domain ecosystem of the receiver, right? So the secret sauce is that if you're sending an email to Comcast or whatever ISP, they see what the recipient is doing with the message. They see how long they've opened it up, they're reading it, they're doing all these things. We don't see that, and we can't track that. Right?
That's right. And
that's called digital reputation. So the more that you have someone engaged in the message, opening, clicking, forwarding, putting your address to the address book, all these positive signs is building a reputation up based on the IP address and the domain and the sender from address, et cetera, that you're sending these messages from. So this builds up over time, and you have to build reputation in order to be able to sustain reputation, in order to be able to sustain continued deliverability. So, and every ISP is different, right? So it's not one shoe fits all across the board. And that's a really important thing to remember. So if you're having problems getting to Gmail, for example, you can solve those problems, but they're not the same as actually trying to get into Comcast.
That's right.
Or BT Internet or Yahoo. They're all completely different. And to what makes it more paramount is that because there's so much consolidation now in the ISP space, right? AOL was acquired, Yahoo was acquired. These things become more important to understand what the expectations are across the board, across the industry. So it's really complex. I mean, it's not an easy thing. If it's an easy thing to do, I'd be living in a much warmer climate on my yacht.
Is there not like a website where I can give me like, you got a 3 out of 5 in terms of deliverability? Wouldn't that be nice? Or do we have that? Or do you have any ideas or how we could get that?
No, because if you think about it from the Genesis perspective, right, the internet was built on anonymity. There's no rules of email deliverability across the planet. The receivers are under no obligation whatsoever to deliver a message unless you're paying to do that. And there aren't any pay to deliver services out there, right? So, when you think about the ESP community today, the ISP community today compared to where a decade ago, ISPs now are essentially ad serving agencies for the ad market. They get more revenue based on what's popping up when you visit a site than they do you spending $19.95 for dial-up as it was 15 years ago. And by the way, AOL still has about 2.5 million dial-up accounts that are still live in the US.
I did not know that. That's crazy.
Progress.
So, okay, I'm sitting amongst two very technically savvy email professionals here. Let me ask the beginner questions. We were mentioning there is the domain reputation and the IP reputation, among other things. What's the difference? And am I on the right track if I'm thinking if I send out a marketing campaign using something like MailChimp compared to if I'm in Gmail and writing a one-to-one message, those are different IPs, but the same domain?
Right. So it used to be that IP address or IP reputation was the paramount signal of being able to send mass mail, bulk mail across the board. And again, the thing to remember is that commercial mail, i.e. products or services, and B2B messaging, right? While they are
like conversation.
Yeah, while they are two different streams of mail, the receivers don't segment that out appropriately, right? They don't give any sort of leeway based on a B2B message or based on a commercial message. So what's happening now is you have this concept called domain reputation. So if your domain is abc.com, anything that associates itself with abc.com will have a reputational assessment based on that. So you could have subdomains under that you could be mailing from. You could have a multinational or multi-domestically layered organization that could be all over the planet, for example. And so your domain reputation is really where you start. Your IP reputation essentially is your driver's license to mail, essentially. It's your social security number of email, right? So if you file bankruptcy...
Can't I just switch an IP like that?
Well, yeah, you
go to SendGrid, grab one.
You could, but that's not a best practice, right? So a best practice is if you get into trouble with your feedback, things like complaints, bounces, spam trap hits, all these things that can negatively affect your sending abilities, you have to repair those problems. You shouldn't just go out and replace your IP address because that's sort of viewed as a very negative behavior, right? The best thing to do is to repair the problem, start over once you've actually repaired the problem.
David, can you actually give us like an example, a concrete example of some problem that could happen and how I would go about solving them? And bear in mind, most of our listeners are probably not institution senders, so they don't have their own sort of email. They're using maybe SendGrid to send things when they need volume, or they may be using just G Suite.
Or an API like QuickMail.
Right.
But QuickMail is using G Suite on the back end or Outlook on the back end, so we don't actually send ourselves. Although this may be also another topic to explore, like, when you're actually sending through a software.
So things that can happen when because remember the first thing you asked me, the first question, and I said it was all about data.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So in the email world, it's all about your list and how you've acquired your list, how old your list is, whether or not people on your list are actually engaging with what you're sending to them, meaning are they opening it up, are they reading it, are they buying your products and services, etc. And that's hard to do in the B2B world because the reality is that it's a business relationship, right? It's different in the commercial side. If you sign up for your golf magazine or your name the product, that's easy to do. So the things that could happen is you could end up with a lot of complaints. People say, this is spam, hit the spam button. That in turn has a negative assessment because that hitting the spam button directly tells the recipient or the receiving domain that, this is unwanted mail, right? So that creates a reputational problem upstream when you try to go mail again. So you could hit spam traps. So a spam trap is an email address that essentially has never signed up for anything commercially or reputationally. And all of a sudden an email pops in there. And there are organizations out there that do nothing but spam trap management, right? So there are groups of folks across the planet that drop email addresses into lists and monitor them to see if they actually get anything that's sent to them, right? So that could happen. I've seen cases where, let's say you're using an ISP, your bandwidth providers via a hosting company. I've seen cases where the hosting company has been threatened to get your bandwidth cut off because you have a bad mailer within their cloud, so to speak. That's sort of quite severe, but that has happened before. And so, so when you come to the market and you start to think, well, I want to get into this channel, this email marketing channel, you have to think about what you have, how you obtained it, how fresh it is, and whether or not it's actually being engaged on. And so the rule of thumb now is essentially if you have an email address on your list that hasn't engaged in your program for, I would say, 6 months now.
And that is open, click, reply.
Yeah, okay. Correct. You might want to start thinking about segmenting that user out into either a reactivation campaign or getting them out of your main mail stream, because it's that type of negative activity that will affect the overall performance of the actual message itself.
So let me bring this into the cold email world for a moment, because certainly we are still in the cold email world, but let's get really specific here. David, let's say I have a campaign that has 5 emails total that I'm going to be reaching out to this list in order to do, my job of following up and trying to get a response. Is it, when we keep in mind how important our reputation is it a good idea to maybe monitor, okay, by the 3rd email I send this list, if anybody hasn't opened it, would it be a good idea to just get them off of the campaign altogether, or is that a little bit harsh?
I think conceptually what you're saying is extremely correct, right? What are my options if I know that Jeremy hasn't engaged in my message over a period of time, right? Now,
I rarely do, so you're picking up the wrong person here.
He might be in the Caribbean having a vacation, right? His email box might be full, so he may not be getting your message, right? So looking at bounce codes and that kind of thing is important. But to your point, the platforms now are so technically advanced that you can actually automate some of those things for you. If you have a marketing automation platform, instant or automated segmentation is something that you could happen over, with a few clicks.
But would you recommend it to me?
I would, yeah. But I'd want to know before I took that draconian step. I would want to know, if I know more about you when I bring you in the program, then I can manage your expectations in terms of the output, right? So maybe no opening in 3 weeks, that might be a little extreme. Maybe it's a month, or maybe it's 6 weeks. But it really depends on what your call to action is in the message, right? If you're...
Tell me more, yeah.
Yeah, so, the reality is that if you're trying to sell me an online stock opportunity, that could be something different than, say, for example, a white paper on biophysics, right? So it really depends on what's contained in your message, and what the actual communication is as well.
How would that make a difference? Let's say one call to action is, hey, I'd like to set up a call. Seems like we've got some, shared business interests. Whereas another is, hey, here's a link to my calendar. Please book a meeting. Would you treat those call to actions any differently?
I would, yeah. Because in your first message, there's some value for me, right? Second message is you're assuming I want to talk to you.
Right.
So the first message is kind of personal. Second message is totally impersonal.
Understood.
Right.
I'm just trying to understand. You had mentioned that I would want to first know the call to action before I was willing to make that extreme measure of axing them off of the campaign. For a message that has either of those calls to actions, how do we know when we should move somebody off of our not opt-in cold email campaign?
I guess the real question is we're trying to get something tangible and actionable. And it seems, and that's also my opinion or my experience, is that it's very difficult to get some hard numbers, some clear rules, and saying if you do this, and that, this is what happens. Is there any way to get to that level of clarity at all? Or are we condemned to live with a Damocles, sword in above our neck and not really knowing what the rules really are until we reach a problem.
Right. So the answer is no, really. I mean, email is extremely complex. It's the art and science of email marketing, right? So we could talk the science, the technical piece all day long. That's great. But if you have that relationship with the recipient and you build that relationship over time, email is easy, right? In the B2B cold calling or B2C cold calling acquisition type, channels of email, that's really, really hard to do well, because as a sender of messages, you're held accountable for the practices of the industry, right? There's three types of messages. There's, commercial messages, there's transactional messages, and then this thing called hybrid, where you have a bit of transactional and a bit of commercial content in them. And to layer on top of that, you have business to consumer, business to business, and then you have the sort of the affiliate marketing type list generation type exercises. So a lot depends on where you are on that scale. I mean, as I said, if it was really easy, it would be a whole different conversation, because it all gets down to the recipients and how the email inbox has evolved. And what you're beginning to see now is beginning to see these ISPs that are offering things like email tabs, promotional tab, main tab, spam. And that trend is going to continue, where the decision of where your email is being placed is a computational assessment of you as a sender, your reputation, how your content is either designed, for example, and your sending history, right? The only way to get into the inbox 100% of the time with all the links working and everything being displayed is to have your from address in the recipient's safe sender list or address book. That's the only way you can get in there 100% of the time.
So is that still a thing? Because, at some point there was all those email marketing, you receive them and they say, oh, please add us to your sender list.
Right.
I never really add anyone in a sender list. I don't even know how to do this, honestly, on Gmail.
Yeah.
So is that still a thing? Because it starts to disappear. Like, I don't see that often anymore.
I think it's important to realize the historical component of that request.
Yeah.
Right. And I think it's important because it still shows proactivity from the recipient, which is, if I'm digging around Gmail trying to find out how to add my from address to my safe sender list, that shows Gmail that I want that message from that sender, right? Whether I'm successful or not.
Hold on.
That's
Gmail knows that I'm trying to move this message around, even if I don't find Big Brother, huh?
Well, they see what we don't see, right? They see everything that we don't see. I mean, they have a heat map of the message. They can figure out what you're looking at, what you're clicking on, right? Because that's what drives their engine.
Is that a thing? Are they looking at heat maps of people interacting with an email?
Sure. Yeah, I'm sure they are. Yeah. It's a captive audience, right? They get to see that. We don't get to see that. We get to see the click, the open.
Right. Are we really talking about Gmail? I mean, for all intents and purposes, like they have 90-something% of the market out there. I mean,
close to that, yeah.
Well, I don't want to call Gmail out. We're not going to make them, the sort of the poster shelf.
Please do. We know how they are.
I can't afford to defend myself in court when they come after me. But
well, we could cut it and keep the thing for us. And
yeah, there you go. I just think it's just this proactive signals for the recipients to figure out whether a message is relevant to the individual that it's being sent to or not. Right. And that's certainly one of them, right? How often do I look at a message? What am I looking at? So it's not just them. I mean, obviously everyone has those tools, or they could have those tools, but that's something that we don't get to see that because we're not monitoring at the actual inbox level.
Right. Okay. So I'm wondering, engagement is such a pillar of deliverability. Is it safe to say the engagement you get from people who get your emails is what makes up your reputation as a sender? So is it safe to say engagement is the number one thing, or is it half data, half engagement? I mean, maybe we can make a little hierarchy of like the one thing we got to get right.
You have to get 4 things right.
All right, hit me.
All right. So you guys aren't going to invite me back again. I know you, but when you think about, the recipe, when you start out from day one as a marketer, things that are important from day one are things like your ecosystem, your infrastructure, your IP reputation, your domain reputation, having RFC compliant messages. So typically, if you outsource that to a third party like a MailChimp or someone like that, they've got that covered. You don't have to worry about that, right?
The RFC compliant. Yeah,
absolutely.
Or use G Suite or use Outlook, right?
Yeah. So if you're using one of those providers, don't worry about that. You're good to go. The things that you have to think about, the 4 components are your business policies, right? How you run your business and who you run your business with, right? So if you're doing things like co-branded marketing, for example, where you're getting lists from multiple providers to put in a message, right? All those lists that come at you will have their own reputations associated with them. So business policies play a big part of it. Data management plays an even bigger part of it now, because let's say I get a list from you, Jack, and I don't do any hygiene on it, and I send it out, then what I've done is I've essentially sent out a list from you with a bad reputation under my brand, and I get the blowback because it doesn't perform particularly well, right?
And just to be clear, when you say it doesn't perform particularly well, I mean, there's some bounces in there above 5%. A lot of people find the messages not relevant, so they mark spam, that kind of thing?
Yes.
Okay.
Right. The third thing is the reputation piece, right? So we talked about that in great depth a moment ago on the podcast. And then finally, the engagement thing is really important, right? So the 4 things you got to get are those 4 things. And if you get them correct and you balance that in your project or in your ecosystem, then you'll be fine, right? You'll be able to manage through that. But again, at the end of the day, there's always a caveat, right? I have been in meetings where Postmaster of AOL sitting in their table, Postmaster of Comcast at a table, and oh, by the way, AOL server farms just gone offline because of a technical problem. There's nothing you can do. Your message is not going to get delivered anyway, right? So we're all slaves to this technology. Reputation, engagement, business policy, infrastructure. Those are the really key things that you got to get your arms around.
Okay.
As you start to think about your program.
And again, there is no hard facts, hard numbers that we could use. Even if we sort of limit ourselves to just G Suite, just Gmail, or just Outlook, just Office 365, and we're not interested in Yahoo, we're not interested in all those
That's right.
other things.
That's right. Because you're only interested in the domains you have on your file.
So is that fair to say that someone knows somewhere and just doesn't tell us? Like, someone at Gmail or, I keep imagining, someone must have those answers somehow, or the actual numbers, the actual algorithms that they're using to determine, how much engagement with an email and so on. Are you aware of anyone who could know or any source we could get, one way or another?
I'm sure there are people I'm sure there are people at their respective domains that have that data, but they'll never give it up because that's what their competitive edge is, right?
Basically, we are sort of like slave to deducing and having some theories, right? But we are not actually able to just say to someone really something concrete at this stage. Is that we know all the variables, but we don't know how much they affect everything. Is that fair to say?
That's correct. Yeah. All
right. So let me hit you with a different angle then in this case.
Okay.
Warming up email is super important at the moment for us. And we hear it. It's a hot topic, funny enough, since it's warm. And there are 3 ways that people can warm up their inbox we know of. There's the easy one, which is you mixed your cold email with normal conversation emails. So maybe you have a certain ratio. Maybe you have like 10 emails that goes to people I know and interact with my email. And then I slip 10 more emails to people I don't know. Okay, so I'm trying to have the mix. The second one is we use a software. And on both ends, either the sender or the recipient or maybe both, they basically exchange some fake engagement with maybe unknown people. They participate to a pool, for example, and they keep on sending them email. And the third one is totally black hat, and I don't like it, but I'm still going to say it, is you basically contact other businesses as part of you got your cold outreach, but you also contact other businesses that are not necessarily a potential lead for you, but they will reply. So things like, hey, do you do transition to retirement? So contacting, financial planners, they will perceive you as a potential lead. And so they will interact with your email and therefore creating some fake, engagement. So how do you actually see those strategies, those approach? Is there Do you have an opinion on any of those, or would you actually recommend another one, or what's your view on those?
I think all the things you said are sort of real examples of being able to conduct those types of activities, right? So the email blending is something that many people adopt, right? It's something out there. 10 to 10 is quite high. I would more probably advise along the lines of 10 to 1. So for every 10 good emails, you have a cold email. Because again, the computational assessment of the receivers now are so more finite than they have ever been before, right? So you're still at mercy of actually what their grades are going to be when it comes to their particular domain. And again, there's so much. 5 years ago, we couldn't talk about having a sort of re-engagement technical solution on a platform because marketing automation probably was in its infancy, right? So
that's right.
If you can get the tech to do it for you, why not? But again, you're still held to the principles of building your data or building your list in a way that isn't nefarious or illegal, because we haven't talked about the law yet. But, we're going to get into that, I'm sure. Mm-hmm. So these are the kinds of things that, can be tracked. Classic example of that is, let's just say you have an agency that's gone out to, is on a sort of a pay-per-click or pay-per-lead model, right? And I have a piece of content and I'm selling, say, a cell phone service. I give that same piece of content to 5 different agencies to mail on my behalf because they're getting paid for the click. At some point in time, that piece of content gets fingerprinted by the receivers, right? So they're going to see the same piece of content come in over and over and over and over again. And if you're the 5th agency that's mailing it, then you're right behind the 8 ball because the other 4 are ahead of you. Well, I guess the point I'm trying to make is that whatever you do, you're going to be technically held accountable for the performance of that. I mean, years ago, the whole concept of out farming your program to folks at colleges to click on links at Yahoo and AOL, and you're paying $5 a month to college students to get your engagement up, right?
I didn't know this one. That's a cool one.
That is good.
Amazon Turk, man.
Right.
Let's go back. What happened with that?
Hey, a click's a click, right? Engagement is engagement. I mean, that's something that, those are years ago, but point being is that you can write a script to do that now, right? You could interact, technically with a platform to allow that platform to communicate with each other some way. It's the same thing, it's just taking the human element out of the equation. I'm not a big proponent of it. Quite frankly, I would advise against those types of habits because the channel is going to kill itself if we abuse it. We have to respect the channel because it's still not going anywhere, right? At the same time, there's always been this conversation between acquisition marketing and retention-based marketing. Those two things, they butt heads all the time. And the reality is that every company out there has to build their database, right? So they can acquire data or they can organically grow it. Organically growing your data is hard to do and it takes a long time. Going to the data market and acquiring data is easy, but you don't have any, engagement or reputation. So when you do this, you basically have to take this subset of your list, your data, and apply the mechanics of relationship-based marketing to this particular list. And that's really, really difficult to do in a way to see results relatively quickly. So it's like a marathon, right? It's not a sprint, it's a marathon.
What are some numbers that might be helpful for people who are taking the data approach where they're acquiring a list like that? Are there any open rates that we should be shooting for or that at least tell us we're better than most? If, let's say I'm a sales guy, I went to the data provider of the day and I downloaded a list of 1,000 prospects that I thought were well qualified, and I'm setting up a relatively new domain. What do you think is a decent open rate, and what could I possibly get if I'm doing a really good job?
I think in the B2B space, if you're doing a really good job, you could be in the high teens, low 20s, maybe.
At what volume?
It really depends. Again, setting volume out is dependent on reputation. So if you're using a vendor that has shared IP pool, for example, you have a bit more flexibility to be able to send more volume based on that particular environment. But if you're on your own dedicated IP addresses, that could be problematic. One thing I've never done, or I should say I've never done, I have very rarely put numbers on a piece of paper and say, this is what you should shoot for, and this is what you should get. Because, it's really just different. Everything changes almost daily. I know it's the number one question, right? It's like, oh, what's the number? But if I give you a number and you're a client of mine, you're going to remember the number I gave you, not necessarily the number that comes out in the platform.
It's true.
And that's why it's really hard. I don't mean to be difficult or, out in left field, but it's
a bit of a
I know.
bullcrap question. I agree with you 100%. Yeah.
And we struggle with those questions daily too. We also run our own experiments and we make our own conclusions.
Right.
David, do you know how long, maybe roughly, how long it takes for a reputation to be resetted? Like imagine, you got a really bad reputation. Should I just, go ahead and then trash the domain and then, which could be difficult if I'm called IBM, for example, or how long do you actually have to sort of like wait before trying the water again? Do you know from your experience?
If you trash an IP address or trash your domain, you're looking at a minimum of 30 days to 45 days to be able to start building that back up. And the reason being is that most of these ISPs now have a month, 30 to 45 day window where you could actually, send them traffic and they start to observe that traffic. Again, some better than others. But if you think of the B2B space, think of the millions of domains out there that are different, right? And again, it all depends on what's on your list, who you're mailing to, and what are those domains listed. So you mentioned earlier, if you have ISPX on there and you don't have anybody on your list from ISPX, you don't care about it. It's not important to you. But if 95% of your list is Gmail, then that's really important to you. So the good news is that a lot of these tools now, the industry itself today is to the point where has developed, it's mature. There's a fine understanding between the expectations of you as a sender and the receivers, what they're looking for. They have published metrics and requirements, Postmaster tools at Gmail and Microsoft, etc. So, there are the ways to go to figure out, what it is you need to do and need to adopt. And that wasn't the case many years ago. It's almost like going down the freeway at night, the lights off on the car because no one had any idea, right? Now the community has come together, the industry and the ecosystem has definitely evolved, which is good because, you know what to be expected. As a sender, if you send X or Y, then your result should be Z, right? And that wasn't the case years ago.
I'm going to ask one more question around this warm up, because if you are sending cold email, most people, even now, are still choosing to purchase a lookalike domain. So instead of mycompany.com, it's mycompany.co. And they kind of got to start from scratch. That's the disadvantage of buying this new domain. However, the idea, at least the idea we have, is it protects that company domain should you land in, Google hell or get flagged as spam long enough. Is that accurate, separating the domains outbound and then, talking to our co-founders and customers? Is that still a good practice and logical?
Let me turn that in reverse for you and give you a concept that would probably illustrate that a little bit better. If you want to be a legitimate marketer of email, any digital channel, then essentially transparency is like the number one thing you have to think about. And what I mean by that is when you vet a customer that comes into your ecosystem, like ESPs do and ISPs do, they look at the things that you've published publicly, like your whois registration, your privacy policy. And so if you are utilizing a like domain to essentially shift the reputation potential from your main domain to someone else, is that being transparent? It could be viewed upon a little bit differently, right?
Yeah.
So if you're a Fisher or you are
from the human or the ISP or ESP?
Both.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
Because there are humans that read your privacy policy when you try to whitelist your IP address, for example, right? I've done that, crazy amount of times. But if you're a Fisher or a criminal, what you're going to do is do exactly this thing that you highlighted. So you go out and do Microsoft.com instead of, and change the O to a 0 to make it look like it's a Microsoft domain when it isn't. So then you can actually conduct your phishing activity for a period of time, make tons of money, bring that domain down and wipe it out. At the same time, you get rich and Microsoft takes the public relations headache because they got phished, right? So transparency is really key. And I think it's important to remember that you can be tracked. You can be tracked back to anything that you publish digitally across the ecosystem. So you certainly can do that. It wouldn't be my recommendation.
So David, let's say I'm good with that idea. Let's be on the up and up. Let's be good marketers here. Let's send cold email from our company domain. Are there any steps I can do if I say, I know I'm going to be doing cold outreach to people who have never heard of me? There's a fear that if I send enough of these cold emails, I will be able to get a message out to my customers because my reputation will crash if I reach out to enough people to say, who the hell's Jack? I don't know this guy. Spam, 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 spam. So what can I do to protect against that if I'm going to be using my company domain?
You can set up a subdomain from your company and send, transactional email, acquisition email out of one email stream, and then company communications out of another. That's a verified practice that a lot of companies adopt.
So I'd like to interact on this one or interject on this one in a sense that this is not what I experimented. So I talked with one of the founder of SendGrid quite a few years back when we had some spam issues. He mentioned to me that one of the ways they solved their own spam issues was effectively to create a subdomain per client that they had, which made sense. And I was like, holy hell, that's simple enough. But what I realized in practice is this was no more the case. And so creating multiple subdomains, actually when the domain was trashed because of one subdomain, whole of the other subdomain were crashing down. So there must be some other rule or some thing that has sort of like linked them together. Of course, the root domain. But in my experience, one of the subdomain going down could effectively bring all the domain down as well with it.
Yeah, I think it could, but it's still segmented out, right? So your risky mail is different from your regular mail. A lot depends on how close to the edge you're going to be from a business perspective, right? Everyone's going to have a different view of that. When you talk about list purchase or data acquisition, those practices are viewed very differently in different circles, right?
Right. Yep.
But if you talk to the company's attorney and they say, hey, our liability is X and we're willing to take the chance of doing a particular practice, then it's out of my hands. That's something that you have to make a decision for yourself. And when we start to see all these laws that are coming into play, GDPR, CASL, CAN-SPAM, CCPA, all these requirements now on marketers, specifically the data market and how that is managed and maintained, it makes it a bit more tricky. So if that's the point saying, if you want to set up a subdomain per mailer, that's certainly something to do, whether you can actually manage that. And I don't believe that SendGrid would have a problem managing that program. It's something that worked for them, and maybe that doesn't work for somewhere else, right? So again, it's just an illustration that one size doesn't fit all.
But theoretically, we could say, let's set up a subdomain for all outbound type emails, thus creating a little bit of a safety net that wouldn't carry over to the emails that we need to make sure it gets delivered to clients, opt-in type leads, that kind of thing.
Right. And if you had a problem on the email stream, then you could actually segment out the resolution of that. It shouldn't necessarily bleed over to your other particular mail channel.
So is that, in your eyes, probably the necessary step if we're going to do, data acquisition and cold email? Is that the setup?
Yeah. So, subdomain is very common for things like transactional messages, right? You wouldn't want to send order confirmation messages out through your acquisition channel or your retention channel because it's mission critical messaging, right? So, that's something to think about. The challenge you have in cold messages is you're starting out of the blocks essentially with two of those components that I spoke about earlier off the table. You have no reputation on the sending and you have no engagement metrics for the recipient. The question is, and this is where the art of the message comes into play, is how do I get you to click on the message?
Yeah.
Right. It's exactly the same concept as walking down the aisle at the grocery store and having that little electronic coupon spit out at you when you walk by the soup because you triggered an infrared sensor on the machine. What is it that's going to make you reach over and grab that coupon and engage, right? And that's what a cold email is. What is it in that message that's going to get my attention? That could be great subject line. It could be great copy. It could be great content. It could be an awesome call to action, right? That's what you have to do. So again, you get all the other components teed up correctly. It's that final piece that's going to make it happen for you. And that's really hard. It's hard because it's different for everyone.
Yeah.
And it's even harder if you're on the 7 deadly sins of email, right? So if you're sending out things that, the 7 deadly sins of email are things that you can't acquire or purchase if you're under the age of 18. Adult content, online meds, guns, tobacco, gambling, payday loan, all this stuff.
Alcohol.
Right? Yeah. Right. So
okay,
there's different levels of products and services.
Fair point.
Gents, don't kill me here. I have one last really quick clarification here. David, if I set up a subdomain for my new cold email account, I still have to warm it up like it's a brand new sending domain. Yes, like treat it as if it's brand new. The only difference is it is linked transparently to my company domain, thus making me more of a on the up and up marketer.
Correct.
Okay, very good. Jeremy, did you have questions about legal?
Well, David mentioned that, so I was curious to figure out, what's his view on that, or what are some of the
You
things
have
we need
legal questions?
No,
You?
I hate legal, honestly. But, that's the sponsor, this podcast is not hosted by two lawyers. So, we got to lawyer up, at some point, Jack, right?
You're right.
We owe it to our audience,
You're right. All right, David, take us to law school.
Well, if I had gone, I would. But, again, I'm not in a position to provide legal advice either. But, I mean, the market is getting regulated, whether we like it or not, right? I mean, it's definitely at the point now where the evolution of data laws globally is paramount and transparent as ever been before. When I started in this business, there was no national legislation in the US. The Cat-Spam Act of 2003 went into effect in 2004. Wow. And if you recall back then, in the summer of 2003, we had the Do Not Call bill that went through Congress that, telemarketers can't call you at home. And then right after the heels of that, the Cat-Spam Act, went into effect in January. There's a lot of reasons behind that, but the point being is it created this national footprint or law for commercial marketing, which, if you look back, it was a good thing to do. It made a level playing field. But in America, we operate in an opt-out arena, meaning I don't need your consent to market to you, whereas the rest of the world, you have to get consent first before you actually market to somebody. And that changes the rules a little bit and creates a little bit of a gray area.
That's also changing, I think, with the Los Angeles law, right?
The CCPA, California, Consumer Privacy Act.
California one.
Right, which went into effect in January. But again, depending which camp you're in, if you're on the B2B camp versus B2C camp, B2B camp will tell you that, hey, these consent mechanisms aren't necessarily applicable to us because it's just different types of data. We're acquiring names, phone numbers, maybe an address, contact, or a title or something like that. Whereas if I'm in the commercial world, I get a whole bunch of different types of data sets on you, maybe credit card, maybe financial services information, maybe some HR data. It just depends. And so really it depends on where, this is where the legal conversations occur in companies where, I can live with this particular set of, business practices, but maybe I can't live with this particular set of business practices. And so when you start talking about the law, it really is an individual-based decision on how a specific piece of legislation is going to affect the operational component of any particular business, right? So these laws are great. They give us frameworks and everything to work in, but ultimately when they're actually adopted and put into place in real time, I think it's a whole different conversation at some point.
Yeah, consult your legal team for specifics, I suppose, right, guys?
That's right.
I'm going to sidestep away from the legal topic just because there's two questions within email content that are constantly swirling around my head, and that is keywords and links. Now, two questions for you, David. What do I need to know about spam keywords? If I have a great reputation, can I just send whatever I want? Any advice?
Start sending some Viagra and stuff.
And then the second one has to do with links, but I'll ask you that afterwards. What's your take on spam keywords?
I think there's a subset of people that think about that. There's been a lot of articles written that don't use free or, Viagra or things like that.
Sure.
I think that's probably accurate, many, many years ago, right? But the reality is that, if I have a relationship with a recipient and there's a history of that relationship engagement-wise, and I'm actually in the medical business, for example, I'm sending out some newsletter that has, one or two words in it. Really, is it really going to get filtered out? Probably not, right? But if I'm sending out, online meds from a cold domain or cold IP, maybe that word would have a bit more weighted assessment on it. But you can test. I mean, the thing about the beauty about email is you could test anything, right? You could test it in real time almost.
Yeah.
There are filters out there that will give you back data on spam words that are in messages or links that are in messages. Some of those tools exist and they've matured and learned from a machine learning perspective over the years. So it just depends, I think, a lot on, what it is you're trying to send and how you're trying to send it.
I can tell you I had a campaign that was for a client in the pharmaceutical space, but not like you would think. not pitching Viagra here, but I will say that the first go round, I looked at our open rates and they were about half what we typically see. And I said, what the hell is this? And I took out that pharmaceutical keyword, tried it again with a synonym, with a very distant synonym, and the open rate doubled. And after that, I said, and this was with a properly warmed up company domain and everything. And it just made me think like keywords are always going to be a wild card. And that's on my list of troubleshooting. But maybe we can just leave it at that.
Yeah. Yeah.
David, we're picking apart this, each element of the email process with like, I don't know, a tiny razor here. And I think up until this point, we've just taken a chainsaw to it and just got very broad strokes. But I'll go granular one last time and then I'll take a pause here. But with links, given that engagement is so crucial to deliverability and reputation, should I be including links in most of my outbound messages, if anything else, just to get that click? I mean, even as long as it's not clickbait, fake news type stuff. I mean, is any click a good click?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think so. I mean, if you're operating on the edge of gray, then you know that, right? I mean, you don't need me to tell me you're operating on the edge of gray and that's your business. And then, quite frankly, if that's the case, then you shouldn't expect to be seeing great results, right? And we're going to start to see this now with the election coming up, right? We're going to see a whole bunch of stuff coming out tailored at the election. We're already beginning to see it. But what's sad about that is that those types of activities really, give the industry a bit of a black eye when it comes to just a regular person trying to do, a regular email campaign with a link in it and try to use the digital channel to their advantage, as opposed to someone else's disadvantage. And that's why it's a shame when you see that happen, because it's not for the greater good of the industry, and that's what that is. But I think anytime, again, the thing to remember here is that links can have reputation associated with them. So if you're generating your own links, that's fine. But if you're using third party or other forms of attrition, then it's important to understand that that link from your trusted partner could be a complete landmine when it comes to your email message when you hit the send button.
Yeah, I can concur that with if you use Bitly, for example, to shorten your URL, just trying to be nice to your user, actually, you got a lot of chances to end up in spam. So yeah, to avoid. Speaking about URL shortener or all these other tools, do you have any, from your experience, David, do you have a list of tools that would be very helpful given the discussion we had, in order to maybe assess your reputation or your domain is well set up, or basically the tools of, what did you say, like tools of the trade or something like that for the, outreach person out there? Yeah,
there's several things out there. And there's also been a lot of consolidation in that space within the industry in the last year or two. So it all depends on whether you're the marketer or the technical person, right? So if you're running your own email program and you're the technical person, you could subscribe to things like MX Toolbox that gives you a whole sense of information as to how you are technically looked at when it comes to your IP and your domain, that kind of thing. And they're really, really helpful. You can set up alerts, you can hit blacklists, you could, delist yourself. And so you could keep the engine running, so to speak. And then there's things like Email Acid and those types of services where you could get your more content-based or content-focused tool to assess, how your email may render in a particular client. The HTML assessment, whether or not you need to fix code or it's heavily weighted in one way or the other. So, and then there's other tools out there which could show you where your email actually ended up. Did it end up in the inbox or did it end up in the spam folder, for example? And so there's a lot of things out there that you can embrace, but the reality is not one tool fits all, right? You don't need to go out and get yourself, a massively in-depth deliverability solution if you're mailing, 500 emails a month, for example, or 5,000 emails a quarter. So just to sort of be buyer aware when it comes to those kinds of things.
The only thing I'm wondering, David, is there something that we didn't ask that you feel that the email marketers out there should know?
It has and always will be a marathon, right? I mean, it's not easy, but you can do it. And if you get it right, it's really, really good ROI. You can't complain at the numbers or the metrics, right? But it's anything else in life. If you think it's a shortcut, then typically it's probably taking you down the wrong direction. So be as transparent as you could be, and and enjoy the channel. I mean, it's not going away anytime soon.
Well said.
David, thank you so much for joining us on the show and really shedding some light on this complex, almost dark topic of email deliverability. It's been enlightening, man. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, David.
You're welcome. Don't forget, wash your hands.
All right, guys. So if you're listening and you want to reach out to David, tell him thanks. Tell him you enjoyed his conversation here. You can reach him on Twitter at Oregon Limey or on LinkedIn. That's linkedin.com/in/Oregon, OREGON, Limey, LIMEY. It's been a pleasure, and hope to talk with you soon, David. Thank you.
Thanks, Chance.
Thanks, David.
Cheers.
Bye.
Hey, cold emailer.
Yeah, you.
If you got some value from this episode, give us a high vibe by sharing a 2-sentence review on iTunes.
Or Stitcher, or TuneIn. That works too.
It's a quick way to help other growth-minded folks like us find this podcast
So they can send awesome emails.
and make everyone's inbox a better place.